What does the future of the meat industry look like? I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. I was listening to a podcast by Sam Harris and some guests, and they were talking about the meat industry and perhaps what it could look like in the future. And after hearing that discussion, I wanted to chime in as well. Now, right off the bat, I will say I do think the meat industry is heading towards obsolescence. I don't think it'll be around for that much longer. Why? Well, there are many downsides here. Downsides that are becoming too noticeable to not account for. So, briefly to go over them, there seems to be three big ones. The first one is the environmental impacts of that industry. So, there are many things that go wrong here. Raising animals is just not good for the earth. Raising them in the context of growing them to be eaten. First of all, many of these animals produce emissions. You have cows, for example, which is quite harmful to the ozone layer and whatnot. Now, when you produce cows in the quantity that we've been doing, you start to accelerate things like climate change. Further, there's a lot of land that is being occupied with those kind of farms and breeding facilities. Then you also have to account for the inputs. It's not like growing a plant where the inputs are simply sunshine and water, things that are quite plentiful. With growing livestock, the inputs are far more varied. You do still need that water and that sunshine, but we've also thrown in medication into that. We've also thrown in food. And when you look at it from that perspective, how much potential food are you putting into the animal and how much are you getting out when it comes to eating them? You certainly need to put in quite a lot, whether it's going to be grain, corn, whatever. They have to eat. Now, I do understand that meat is something of a more luxurious good, at least historically, so people are willing to neglect the amount of food that has to go into it to produce something that reaches a level that can be consumed. You're not going to be eating a cow fresh out of the womb. It has to grow up a little bit. Now, of course, there are people who do eat younger cows and whatnot, but I wouldn't say that's the norm. And the same is true for chickens and whatnot. Maybe chickens are a better example. I don't think there are too many people who eat baby chickens. Why? Because there isn't enough meat on them yet. And to really get a proper return on the animal, in terms of quantity that can be consumed, there is some growing that has to happen there. And that takes resources, and there is a certain burden that's placed on the environment because of that. Another issue that does have me quite worried is this antibiotic overdependence that we're seeing in the industry. Many scientists are ringing the alarm right now. They're saying that what we're doing with produce and livestock could spell the end of modern medicine. And why is that? Well, antibiotics are mixed into these animals' foods on the daily. Why? Well, many farmers don't want to see these animals become sick. Perhaps they want to make them larger, healthier, more robust. The antibiotics can do that. But there is a massive downside. These things are not 100% effective. They're something like 99.9% effective, but every time you consume an antibiotic, there's a chance that certain bacteria will escape. Bacteria are living organisms, and you can think of them as humans kind of in some way. They're different. The ways they're made up is reliant on their genome, their DNA. Certain bacteria have certain DNA that is resistant to an antibiotic. And if they're able to fight off the antibiotic and live, and then breed, they're going to pass on those genes. And it won't be a diluted gene pool. The weaker siblings of the bacteria won't be around to breed too. But now because you killed off all the weak ones, you're essentially acting as a force of natural selection. You're selecting for the strongest ones, and they're going to absorb the gene pool. They're going to take over, and before long, you could have a colony of bacteria that's invincible to the antibiotic that was previously the detriment to them. The current irresponsible practices in relation to antibiotics and feeding animals them nonstop is ushering in an age of superbacteria. Now, there are things that can be done about that. I've covered it before. There is a substance called a necrophage, I believe, and they're like the organic counterpart to an antibiotic. Well, antibiotics could be organic too, but they're living things that can also evolve. Like how the bacteria can be selected to become immune, the necrophage can be selected to become extra effective against whatever the bacteria is. Now, because you have that third party in the equation, a cycle of evolution and susceptibility can iron itself out in our favor, but it's not a guarantee. And nevertheless, it's still a disturbing practice that we're seeing today when it comes to this abuse of antibiotics, which should be reserved for special cases and when they are needed, not a general all-purpose tool, because we know what that does. And despite us knowing that, nothing is being done to curb that practice. And we don't see that same thing when it comes to vegetable and fruit farming. Why? Because the structure of those organisms is different than livestock. And further, there are questions about ethics that come up. Many of these poultry, livestock, cattle farms, they operate in inhumane ways. These creatures are being bred to eat, which is one thing, but they're crammed into small spaces. They are not able to enjoy their life to whatever extent is possible in most cases. They're being grown to proportions where they can't even move in some cases. It's just not a pretty scene. And I mentioned this before in another episode when we were talking about UFOs and whatnot. People are fascinated with the notion of life beyond Earth, but there is plenty of life on Earth that we don't treat that well, that we treat quite badly, actually. Living organisms, and if you were to find a cow in space, I'm sure people would be in awe of that, but we do have these creatures which are quite miraculous walking the Earth. And the ways in which we go about handling them is nothing short of genocidal in some cases. So what's the solution here? Do we abolish the meat industry? Do we impose hefty fines for partaking in this consumption? I don't think so. I think those are rather extreme things that will not produce the outcomes that we want to see. So, what can we do? I'm quite in favor of the lab-grown option. There's no need to force everyone to become a vegan or a vegetarian. If we can take away some of these negatives of the quote-unquote meat industry, will it still remain the meat industry after we've developed a certain scientific approach to develop meat in a lab? Well, I do think it still would be meat, but maybe not the traditional notion of it. But still, that's the path I do want to see. I don't think we can force people to make dramatic lifestyle changes here. We can try to incentivize them as best we can, but the market, that's what truly is going to change people's lifestyles here. And the market approach has to be done via something like this lab-grown alternative. Now, there are two factors here. Well, maybe three. When you hear lab-grown, first of all, there is sometimes an ick factor there. Ew. What is that? Are we thinking about a pink gelatinous slime that comes out of a conveyor belt? If I had to choose between that and a actual real chicken, quote-unquote real, you'd probably want to opt for that if that's the image you have in your mind. So tackling that is the first thing that has to be done. And you can definitely achieve that through some combination of marketing, branding, and perhaps making things seem a little bit less nasty. I don't think the way things are created is through that pink gelatinous slime method, but people don't know that. In fact, there hasn't been much education done on the lab-grown procedure at all. If we understood what happens there would perhaps be less of an aversion to it. Perhaps going over things like how carefully vetted the procedure is, how safe the materials are, and maybe even doing something interesting like a blindfold test, getting to a point where if you had a burger that was created using lab-grown meat and one that came out of McDonald's, would the person be able to differentiate the two? The closer you get to them not being able to, is the closer you get to a wide market adoption of something like a sustainable lab-grown alternative. And to really accelerate that, there are further two variables that really matter. If you want people to adopt this lab-grown meat over the traditional options, it's taste and price. So, if price, first of all, is able to be brought down to be on par or even less than the more natural, you could call it, methods of attaining meat, the livestock, the poultry farms, the slaughterhouses, there would be an immense incentive to switch over right there, saving money. People love doing that. And if they can bring their grocery bill down while still getting something similar to what they're used to, they'll flock towards that. That should be a major incentive for many of these firms. Whoever can come up with a lab grown or whatever type of alternative they can come up with to meat, and they can make it at a cheap clip, they're going to do extremely well. Investors will be salivating at the thought of that. Currently, we do have some of these green lab-grown options, but in almost every case, they are more expensive than the traditional meat varieties. If that's the case, if you have something of an unknown product, something that has a hue to it that may not be so attractive, and you're charging more for it, it's no wonder why it hasn't caught on to a large degree yet. And the second variable that you have to consider in relation to price is taste. Now, if the price is lower but it tastes horrible, it's disgusting, it's a piece of goop, people aren't going to want that regardless of how cheap you price it. But if you can get the price and the texture and the consistency and things like that on par with the real thing, then you're really cooking. Then you really have something that the market will adopt very quick. And we could solve this entire dilemma with this one solution. It wouldn't be a matter of converting everyone to vegans, getting them to do this, getting them to do that. The market can easily handle this problem given the right product. And I have no doubt that it's possible to create something like this. As science advances at the rate that we're going, this is not an impossible task. We already have alternatives. We already have creations. It's just a matter of getting the price down and refining the quality a bit. When you factor in things too, like these companies who go with the lab-grown option will not have to do things like pay for massive amounts of lands to grow the livestock because they just be creating it in the lab. They wouldn't have to feed it for how many years it takes to reach maturity. They wouldn't have to clean up and hire crews and whatever. You could save on the staffing, you could save on the real estate, you can save on the inputs. There's no reason why something like a lab-grown alternative would come out more expensive, especially when we refine the formula. Investing in this is a great idea because accelerating the timeline here, right now we're at a place where maybe the quality isn't as good and the price is very high. If we can put some money into this and get it going, maybe even at the governmental level to create funds for it, if we can get the taste on par with the real thing and bring the price down, the problem will very likely solve itself, and that will have a major impact on climate change and the climate crisis. This could be a game changer, but it hasn't been treated as such. And now the final point I'll make that might get you on board with a lab-grown or green alternative is the pandemic risk. It's no secret that many pandemics spawn from the ways in which we handle livestock. Now, it hasn't been confirmed with COVID-19, there are theories floating around, but one of the prominent ones is that this spawned in a wet market. Livestock being in such close proximity, bacteria and viruses hop in between each other. It's not good. And you can look back in time. Lots of pandemics and viruses and epidemics spawn from live creatures being in close proximity to humans. And these viruses or bacteria end up evolving and being able to affect us. If we can cut that chain there and not have to be so reliant on these creatures and the ways in which we're consuming them that can produce a pandemic, that'll be a net positive for everyone. It'll probably be better for the future generations too, in that regard. I'm sure we don't want to go through another 2-year lockdown during our lifetimes, and this here could be the key to that. When you play this game of pandemic risk, it's very clear that right now, if we don't change anything, we're bound to have another pandemic soon. And how you define soon, it could just be a matter of 20 years. We've seen that timeline. Could be 50, or it could be 100. So maybe soon isn't the right word. Perhaps eventually. Another pandemic will eventually hit if we don't change the ways in which we operate. There is something of a wake-up call that has to be had here. You can look through history, whether it's the Spanish flu, these various pandemics that have occurred, COVID-19, swine flu, SARS. These things are animal-born initially, and then they transition to being able to affect humans. And if we really want to eliminate or get as close to eliminating the risk for another pandemic as possible, something like developing these green lab-grown alternatives to our traditional livestock breeding methodology is something very important to consider. When you look at the pros and the cons here, there really isn't much of a pro argument to be pro meat industry to be pro status quo. There are just too many negatives here, and we've learned a lot as a civilization, and we're getting close to a point where valid alternatives are cropping up, and they're getting ready for mass market appeal. To not accelerate that, to hold on to the vestiges of this traditional meat industry, it's a major mistake, and no country should be making that. We certainly live in very interesting times, and we are on the precipice of another breakthrough here. I wholly believe that figuring out this dietary issue when it comes to meat consumption, that could be something that spurs our climate action and gets us to a point where the future seems a little bit more rainbowy and less bleak. But like with all things, we'll have to see how it plays out, and I do encourage you to do your research and look into it as well. There are very promising things cropping up here, and if you're asking yourself, well, what can I do to make an impact? Truly, investment is where things have to start. There are companies with the idea already. There are companies developing the product, but these things take time. Research and development, mass market testing, rebranding, whatever it's going to be. And these companies need resources more than anything, I would imagine. Of course, you can also try and raise awareness too, but raising awareness about something that really isn't ready for the market yet, it could be a futile effort, especially when you consider how much good you could be doing by funding companies like this. And I don't think you should fund them for free. They are corporations after all. Something like trying to purchase stock or bonds might be the way to go, or perhaps even lobbying the government, trying to convince them to take part, to create grants for these companies. And, of course there'll be attention there. The government is very chained to old stakeholders. We see that with the dairy industry, for example, in Canada. I can only imagine what type of pressure the typical farming and agricultural sector of the economy will apply to the government to not accept these changes. But looking at the timeline, it's just something that we know is coming up. And it's beneficial to get on board now rather than wait. If Canada can become the hub for this new technology, for example, we can become the leader in the lab-grown green meat industry, that'd be major. Trying to be the leader in the traditional slaughterhouse meat industry is not any good. It's a dying thing. It's like trying to be the leader in fossil fuel-based cars now. We know the market has shifted and interest is heading towards electric. That's where you want to be. With meat, the same thing is happening. If Canada can wake up and figure these things out, we stand a good chance of becoming a leader here, benefiting not only citizens and their diet, but our economy. Can you imagine? Canada already lacks certain innovation in many sectors. We don't have a comparable tech industry as, for example, the States. We are quite strong with financials. Our banks are very powerful. But why not try and get into tech? And here's a golden opportunity. If Trudeau and his cabinet is listening right now, this is something I highly suggest looking into. So with that, it now brings us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.